So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We'll finish this essay on Heart of Darkness, which we're reading at the moment. And if you remember, the last time we stopped, we talked about the phantom-like quality of the character of Kurtz in Joseph Conrad's novel, and how the spectrality of the character corresponds to the very complex political condition that he is embodying and representing. So we will start off from that point, and this should be on your screen. So we just left off, if you remember the last session, the very metonymic quality of Kurtz's characterization, where his mother was half English, his father was half French, and we also get to know all of Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. So there's this very metonymic quality in which his character is essentially manufactured. So this is on your screen. This is characteristic of the product perfected and manufactured by the industries and ideologies of European civilization. It is also a pointer to the impalpability that Marlowe experiences while attempting to find a narrative rationale that would describe Kurtz's presence. So there's no narrative method through which the full body of Kurtz, the full presence of Kurtz can be articulated or described. So Kurtz always remains some kind of a translucent, impalpable presence, and the spectrality and translucence about Kurtz is also part of the narrative confusion that Heart of Darkness exhibits and foregrounds and illustrates. So the contingency that characterized the construct of Kurtz appears more explicitly at the end, where Marlowe receives various reports and varying reports on Kurtz's political and personal attributes from his various acquaintances and relatives. So there are different reports about Kurtz, there are different kind of attributes and descriptions of Kurtz, which all lead to the very chaotic condition of this very nervous narrative that Marlowe is delivering. So Marlowe's confusion about Kurtz, who remains more a voice, a spectral presence, and a symptom of hollowness out of excess rather than a palpable individual, is made evident thus, and as a quotation from the novel. To this day, I'm unable to say what was Kurtz's profession, whether he ever had any, which was the greatest of his talents. I had taken him for a painter who wrote for papers, or else a journalist who could paint. But even the cousin who took snuff during the interview could not tell me what he had been exactly. So this lack of exactitude about Kurtz, the lack of specific certainty about Kurtz, makes him a very phantom-like figure, a very spectral figure, and that spectrality is obviously part of the narrative confusion that Marlowe was experiencing as well. Now, in this section of the essay, we'll talk about how this corresponds to some critical theory vocabulary, especially Jacques Derrida's idea of the coast, or the whole idea of inaccessible articulation that Derrida talks about in his definition and description of the apparition, right? So the apparition in Derrida is something which is inaccessibly present, or inaccessibly articulated, or incompletely articulated. So there's this interplay of incompletion and inaccessibility that makes the whole idea of apparition very, very important. And as Derrida would go on to say, this is the apparition of the inapparent, something which is not visible. So in his permanent incompletion and contingency, Kurtz remains for Marlowe what Derrida had classified as an inaccessible articulation that characterizes the play between the spirit and the revenant. In a spectral quality that frustrates rational understanding and narrative reasoning, Kurtz is also a disappearing apparition that paradoxically perpetuates presence. So this whole idea of appearance and disappearance, the whole idea of apparition and presence, this interplay, this liminality about Kurtz is important, because that is what characterizes him as a phantom figure. And this is the quotation from Derrida. For Derrida, analyzing the apparition of the inapparent, and there's a quote, "For there to be a coast, there must be a return to the body, but to a body that is more abstract than ever. The spectrogenic process corresponds, therefore, to a paradoxical incorporation. Once ideas or thoughts are detached from the substratum, one engenders some coast by giving them a body. A more acute specificity belongs to what could be called the second coast, as incorporation of autonomized spirit, as objectifying expulsion of interior idea or thought. So the whole idea of interiority and projection, phantom and fantasy is present in this idea of incorporation, the paradoxical incorporation. So the only way the apparition can be integrated or incorporated is through methods of spectrality, right? So, Derrida over here talks about the spectral presence, the spectrogenic presence, the whole production of spectrality, the production of this phantom-like phenomenality, if you will, and how that can be sort of interestingly mapped or mappable rather in the description of Kurtz in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So, with his entanglement of the apparition of the body and the body of the apparition, so there's this interplay, the apparition of the body and the body of the apparition, Kurtz in Heart of Darkness appears to embody Derrida's second coast. That is impossible to exercise or expostulate away, but must be mourned forever in a manner that approximates the process of fetish formation. So again, we're using some kind of a Marxist vocabulary over here, the commodity fetish or fetish formation. So we can see how fetish, which is sort of hypermateriality, if you will, is paradoxically comparable to the idea of spectrality. So on one hand, at a very political level, Kurtz becomes Kurtz because he is absolutely enmeshed in this very hyper-materialist consumption of the imperial commodity, which is the ivory in this case. But in his absolute absorption into the commodifying process, he also gets reified and alienated in a very Marxist sense, and that paradoxically makes him some kind of a spectral presence. So the idea of spectrality and materiality combined together in very, very complex ways. Now, so Kurtz in Heart of Darkness embodies what Marlowe at the beginning of the novel had classified as an idea, something that you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to, something noble, something grand, something bigger and broader than the individual, the idea. That desperate clinging onto a strategy of abstraction in an attempt to redeem the vulgar materiality of imperialism and its exploitative machinery, right? So the whole idea of how some kind of a redemption is only possible through abstraction, through spectrality, through phantom formation, right? So Kurtz becomes so absorbed in his entire commodity fetish, the commodity consumption of imperialism. His only redemption at a spiritual level is by becoming spectral, right? Which is why Kurtz is defined and described through metaphors of spectrality throughout the novel. Now, Kurtz's over-identification with the imperial order, and this is a reference from Zizek, who's written extensively on Kurtz, he moves from being a universal genius to a degenerate, far from being a painter-musician to an anarchic ruler presiding over savage ceremonies. So this entire over-appropriation that happens in Heart of Darkness emerges as a further pointer to the complex cognitive mappings in Heart of Darkness, whereby affect precedes the object. So again, we talked about delayed decoding in the earlier class. We see how even here, the vocabulary is very cinematic. We talked about how already that this particular novel is written at a time in which the visual vocabulary is changing. The grammar of description at a visual level is transitioning from a purely textual narrative method to a more cinematic, shall we say, diegetic method, right? So there is that visual quality, that visual vocabulary, which is quite apparent in Heart of Darkness as well. But there is that quality where affect precedes the object, where the impression comes before the entity, right? So that is a whole delayed decoding, the thing that happens in Heart of Darkness and elsewhere in Conrad's writing as well. The complexity of Conrad's novel is also borne by the manner in which Kurtz's centerlessness and spectrality are conveyed at three different yet connected orders of reception. So there is a sort of centerless spectral quality about Kurtz, which operate at a very sort of triangulated manner. So three different methods, three different points, orders of reception. How? Marlowe's, so the way Marlowe receives Kurtz, his immediate audience, so the story that Marlowe is telling to his immediate people in the boat, and of course readers, people like you and I who are reading the novel. So there is a transferable quality of the horror in Kurtz. So Marlowe receives the horror. He's the first receptacle, the first recipient of Kurtz's spectrality. He tries to pass it on to his immediate audience, who are the people in the boat. And the inset narrator is also there. And of course, the ultimate audience of the story are the readers who are reading the book. So the horror that Kurtz articulates in the end, one that appears in Marlowe's mind as an expression of some sort of belief, the appalling face of a glimpsed truth, stems from the self's cognition of his own hollowness, and that appreciable moment in time in which we step over the threshold of the invisible. So that, again, there's a sort of transgressive quality about it, stepping across the threshold of the invisible. And there is a moment of horror. The horror is the transgression of the stepping across the line and the consequences of that. So again, the very thin line between capitalist machinery of exploitation and pure atavistic greed, right? So the machines, the engines of imperialism also produce at some level the pure engines of greed, the pure atavistic quality of greed and violence, which is sort of primitive in quality as well. So the really radical thing about Heart of Darkness is how it locates the primitive, violent quality not in the non-white person, but actually in the white subject. The pure, the most perfect white subject is also the most primitive. Now, most atavistic, most primal in its sort of violent manner. So again, what this novel is showing is how the sort of borderline between the civilized and the uncivilized, the white and the non-white, begin to blur away in these complex geopolitical and psychological conditions. Right. Now, there is that quality that Marlowe gains, that the knowledge that Marlowe gains from his experiences in Congo, ones that he wants to communicate, encode, implot, and then transfer over to his immediate audience, and then obviously to the rest of the readers. But of course, the transference is a failed transference. It's not able to implot or encode it properly or adequately. So the knowledge that Marlowe gains from his journey into the heart of darkness, the one that he cannot completely convey to or disclose, like the trade secret of the unnamed Belgian company he had worked for in the Congo, comes to consume him with his hysteric formation. So there is a sort of hysteric, neurotic quality about Marlowe. And part of it is also because he cannot convey, he cannot transfer the trauma, he cannot transfer what he actually went through into a neat narrative. So the neatness of the narrative is missing over here. So classic realism, which had worked for Robinson Crusoe, doesn't work for Marlowe anymore. So this is a classic deconstruction, if you will, of classic realism. So haunted by the hollowness and horror articulated by Kurtz, as well as increasingly tormented by the memory of Kurtz's death, Marlowe is increasingly characterized by an odor of guilt, which is intentional as well as existential. Inasmuch as it's directed towards something specific as well as something indescribable. So there is this hypermateriality about Kurtz, like I mentioned. He becomes the ultimate imperial agent who becomes the ultimate accumulator, if you will, of the imperial commodity. At the same time, the same hypermaterialism also produces spectrality, also produces something which is phantom-like and cannot be put into words, cannot be described. So back in the sepulchral city of Brussels. So, interestingly, when Marlowe comes back to Brussels at the end of the novel, there is a coffin-like quality, death-like quality about Brussels as well, which is this white European city. So back in the sepulchral city of Brussels that sees little men run with the little businesses, Marlowe confesses his impotent rage at the spectacle of triviality thus, and this is how he describes. They were intruders whose knowledge of life was to me an irritating presence, because I felt so sure they could not possibly know the things I knew. So there is that envy that Marlowe has while looking back or looking at this sort of other white people in Brussels. It's a patronizing gaze, but also envying gaze, because they are protected by their innocence, or protected by their ignorance, so almost immunized, if you will, by the ignorance. So there's a sense of immunity produced by the fact that they don't know what really happens or takes place in the heart of darkness where Marlowe has been too. And once he has seen it, he cannot unsee it, he cannot unremember it. And that begins to haunt him forever, and that gives him a sense of guilt, a sense of ambivalence, a sense of heaviness, which makes him feel melancholic in quality. And of course, when he looks at the other people running more the businesses, normal lives, he feels envious of their presence. So I felt so sure they could not possibly know the things I knew. Their bearing, which was simply the bearing of commonplace individuals going about the business in assurance of perfect safety, was offensive to me. It's a very important word, offensive. I mean, I find it offensive that they are going about the businesses in normal ways, were benefiting secretly and without even realizing it from the fruits of imperialism. Whereas I have been to the heart of darkness, where I've seen how the entire imperialism or the engines of imperialism work, and the darkness associated with that production process, production consumption process, production consumption perpetration process. Whereas these are people who are the innocent, immunized bystanders. Right. It was offensive to me that the outrageous flauntings of folly in the face of a danger it was unable to comprehend. So it's got no idea of the risk and the precarity that the other people are having to go through for them to enjoy this innocent, idyllic, immunized life. So, so what happens is Marlowe obviously gets an insight into the heart of darkness, an insight, almost an epiphanic insight into what really goes on, what really takes place in the heart of darkness. At the same time, this knowledge makes him feel superior. At the same time, it makes him feel guilty. So in some sense, it's inferior. It's morally inferior because he knows the darkness that takes place in the secrets of the empire. So the privilege that Marlowe ascribes to himself emerges also as loss, one that comes with the nihilistic knowledge of the inadequacy of the shared civilizational security that runs across the European metropolis and its mental life. So there's a sense of civilizational security, and if you remember your class, the last session, we talked about how Marlowe was having this sort of desperate address to his audience, saying that you are so comfortably situated between the butcher on one hand and the policeman on the other hand. There's security, there is civilization, there's food. So you have no idea what we had gone through in the heart of darkness. There is that jealousy, that envy of being vulnerable, of being insecure by what you know at the moment. So as he tottered about the streets, the scene of urban life appears to Marlowe as essentially one of ignorance and inanity, and the loss that he experiences and embodies paradoxically bypasses extreme grief in its emptiness and takes the form of apathy. Now, this is very important, apathy. So the whole indifference that Marlowe experiences over here is some kind of feelinglessness. He's also numbed by this repetitive nature of trauma and violence that he is unable to respond to anymore. And then it becomes, at a very, very blunt sensorial level, he becomes apathetic in quality. He becomes indifferent in quality. So, appearing as it does, as a survivor of a crisis that had consumed the best of Europe, Marlowe emerges as essentially incompatible with the smooth seamlessness of the metropolis and its mental life. So we see something happening, for example, if you read a novel like, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So there too we have a character called Septimus Smith, who comes back after the First World War, but he's absolutely unable to reintegrate himself into normative civilian life in the metropolis. So he's always the outlier. He's always the alienated killjoy, if you will. And something similar happens with Marlowe here. So everyone seems to be getting on with their lives, but Marlowe is unable to get on because he has seen too much. He has suffered too much. He knows what really goes on, and he cannot unknow it. He cannot dismember it from his memory. So, so there is this very interesting existential neurological quality that Marlowe embodies, which is, the whole idea is about describing his alienation. Now, towards the end of the passage, you see that Marlowe also complains of some medical conditions. He has fever, for example, anxiety attacks, for example. So, unsurprisingly, this should be on the screen, unsurprisingly, Marlowe describes himself at this passage as not very well, grinning bitterly at perfectly respectable persons. So there seems to be some kind of a lack and loss of nervous controls. He grins at the most inappropriate places. So obviously he's exhibiting signs of nervous control, of lack of nervous control. With the temperature, it's almost feverish, with a temperature that was seldom normal in these days. So he experiences and he shows symptoms of PTSD to a certain extent. So he's restless, he has anxiety attacks, he's feverish on many occasions, etc. So in his neurotic temperament and existential disconnectedness, following an experience of horror and loss, Marlowe may be read as a figure embodying the state of the Turgenevian superfluous man. So this is a very important figure in modernism, the Turgenevian superfluous man. So the whole idea of the superfluous man comes from the Russian writer Turgenev. It's theorized by Turgenev. One of the best examples would be, Gogol's story, The Overcoat, where the protagonist is a classic example of the superfluous man. Someone who's so buried by bureaucracy, someone who's so buried by the engines around him, the engines of functionality, the engines of production, the engines of consumption, that his entire human agency gets absolutely depleted. And the depletion of agency makes him superfluous. So we have that superfluous quality in Marlowe as well. So there is a Turgenevian superfluous man who embodies, and there's a quote, an egoistic, albeit intelligent sensibility, rather decadent or neurotic in its oscillations of mood, a cynical or ironic quality, and above all, the sense of being superfluous without role or function, isolated from society. A sense of isolation is there as well, right? So there is that quality that Marlowe begins to exhibit in Heart of Darkness too. Ending as it does, in the pose of a meditating Buddha, Marlowe in Heart of Darkness emerges less as a signifier of spiritual wisdom than a hollowed out seer who can pose like a prophet but is unable to articulate his knowledge of loss, as that would have been too dark altogether, right? So there's this fear of darkness, the abyss that he's looking into, and he cannot communicate it. So he can pose like a Buddha. He can, have this anatomical, mimetic ability to imitate the Buddha, the enlightened person. But unlike Buddha, unlike the prophet, he cannot talk about what he has learned. He cannot talk about his knowledge because it's a very nihilistic knowledge of darkness. So the enlightenment that Marlowe has in Heart of Darkness is a negative enlightenment. Darkness is a knowledge of nothingness, if you will. And that knowledge of nothingness is something which we find consuming him at some point of time, right? So Heart of Darkness remains a very, very complex text about a very complex geopolitical situation, about imperialism and the entire ambivalence on imperialism and the guilt and shame of imperialism, which is comparable to some extent with Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, which we finished reading, but also it's a deeply and profoundly psychological novel. So there is alienation, there's neurosis, there's trauma, and there's constant sense of anxiety attack and self-doubt, and very self-reflexive hyper-awareness that Marlowe suffers from. So Heart of Darkness, just to conclude, Heart of Darkness is a complex narrative that situates the self and its existential inwardness in moments of epistemic violence and cognitive crisis, with a backdrop of a real imperial setting and with all its horrors and hubris. So there is hubris, there's horror, and there is that entire misadventure narrative of the empire agent gone wrong, gone rogue, shall we say. Its uniqueness, despite the rhetoric of his times, which retains his descriptions of non-Europeans and African atavism. So, for example, no African speaks in Heart of Darkness, and there's no voice given to the non-white person. So it's very problematic by modern standards, which is why Chinua Achebe calls it a racist novel. But, one must also locate Heart of Darkness in terms of its contemporary standards, in terms of his, of his times. So that entire thing emerges from and there's a quote, a tension, some split heritage, divided between the demands of the adventure and the literary novel. So there is that adventure novel story in Heart of Darkness, but there's also the very self-reflexive literariness in Conrad's writing as well, which is manifesting itself through defamiliarization, through delayed decoding, through deceleration. So all that self-reflexive literary language, literary register is also making its presence felt, along with the misadventure novel. So the sort of seamless flow of action, along with the inaction and the interruption of the literary novel. So that goes sort of hand in hand. They go hand in hand in very incongruous, sometimes incompatible ways. And that incompatibility is important because that is foregrounded, which is what makes a novel so dense and difficult in many ways. So in its self-reflexive epistemology of unlearning and uncertainty, Conrad's novel maps a feeling unchanging mind onto an imperial order that historically perpetuated its ideologies through an entanglement of falsehood and self-contradiction. So the whole idea of legitimizing imperialism, legitimizing territorialization is sort of deconstructed and debunked in Heart of Darkness, because there is this anxiety and a guilt and a self-doubt and a cynicism foregrounded right at the beginning of the novel. So in its articulation of failure and its failure of articulations, there is an interplay that it talks about the failed project of imperialism. At the same time, it talks about the failure to articulate what really happened or describe what really happened. Heart of Darkness dramatizes a complex political, psychological, and existential ambivalence that shows what it means to be fully and painfully human in a world of ideological overdeterminism. So in a world where everything is overdetermined, preset, predetermined by dominant ideological constructs. So Heart of Darkness gives us a very human picture of hollowness, cynicism, ambivalence, and agency-lessness. So it reveals the ability of a literary text and a work of fiction to describe the complexities of human consciousness and embodied experience, mapping the same onto a crisis of knowledge and narration. So that old thing about knowledge and narration comes back. So what is known by Marlowe cannot be communicated because there is no narrative method which can adequately communicate what he has seen. And what he has seen, he cannot unsee. So there is a glimpse into darkness, the epiphany into nothingness, a deep sense of shame and guilt looking at the entire politics of exploitation, territorialization, and grotesque violence, really, which happens in Heart of Darkness. And it is a failed report. The entire novel, it fails to deliver the true, correct, authentic report of what really goes on in Heart of Darkness. At the same time, it's a report about failure. So there is that, like it's written away, articulation of failure and failure of articulation. So that interplay is important in Heart of Darkness, which then obviously gets reflected through a crisis of knowledge, compounded by the crisis of narration. So with that, we end reading this essay. We'll have one more session on Heart of Darkness where we talk about the sort of cultural, political, geographical setting in which this novel is written, through which a novel emerges. But it's important for us to situate the novel in the context of its times, in terms of looking at how it is one of the really first novels to talk about the guilt of imperialism, to talk about the uneasiness of imperialism, the ambivalence about imperialism, not trying to whitewash it, not trying to glamorize it, glorify it, but rather talking about the inglorious empire and how that can bring out the worst out of humankind. Because what happens to Kurtz is a classic case of descent, moral descent, spiritual descent, emotional descent, and of course it ends with his very mysterious death. And of course, the final words that he has before he dies are the horror, the horror. So there is that quality of horror, there is a quality of descent, there's this quality of degeneration which take place in Heart of Darkness. And I think it's a very important novel because it speaks to our times in very complex ways. It speaks to the whole idea of the complicit agent of terror, the complicit agent of violence, and the sort of self-doubt and cynicism and anxiety that come when you're complicit in something that you don't fully or spiritually subscribed to fully. So there is that quality of ambivalence, the quality of self-doubt, the quality of anxiety, and all that get really entangled in a narrative crisis in Heart of Darkness, right? So there is that quality of not being able to say what really took place, not being able to articulate what really went wrong in the sort of the Heart of Darkness, as it were, and this constant self-doubt, the constant neurosis of being the bad narrator. So it's a really good story about writing the inadequate story about what went wrong, not finding the right narrative method to describe what went wrong in the sort of the recesses of the empire. So with that, we end reading this essay. We'll have a few more sessions on the talking strictly on the political, cultural context from which this novel emerges. But I hope this essay gives you some flavor of the psychological, existential, emotional, cognitive conditions informing the very misshapen narrative in Heart of Darkness and how that corresponds to the very complex, very dark, very ambivalent geopolitical conditions in which the novel is situated. So with that, we end this particular essay. We move on to a new essay through which we'll end this particular novel. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you in the subsequent sessions.